Sweet promises given to all who believe.
Today, we are responding to the question, did the believers in the New Testament return tithe? This is a boiling question. But before we look at that, we'd like to warmly invite you to subscribe to this channel if you are yet to subscribe, and share this video and other videos that we have prepared for the world, for the church, for your family and your friends. And like this video in particular because it's a wonderful topic that we are dealing with today. We believe you are going to be blessed as you listen to the presentation and be a blessing as you share. Thank you very much for joining this movement in spreading the gospel as we prepare for the soon coming of Jesus. Let's begin and look at the issues that we are to address in connection with this question. We are dealing with the question of whether believers in the New Testament period return tithe as a religious obligation as was in the Old Testament. Some people have vehemently claimed that because the New Testament is silent on tithing, returning tithe today is not a requirement. Others think that the believers are spiritual Israel and that tithe returns are a requirement. In this presentation, we will trace the circumstances that necessitated the institution of tithing in the Old Testament and whether the New Testament situation warranted returning or non-returning of tithe. So embrace yourself. Before we look at the New Testament scenario, let's understand what tithing is. It's important to get this basic understanding. In the ancient Near Eastern cultures where Abraham was born, was raised, and lived for many years before God called him, tithing was practiced as far back as 14th century BC, and a tithe of stated goods or property was given in support of the king and royal temple. Underlying these two institutions, the political institution and the religious institution, to be regulated and to continue to operate, these institutions had to be financed, and the only way to be financed was through tithing, that is, giving a tenth of one's stated goods and property. That was a culture before the Bible was even written, and Abraham was born in this environment. In the Old Testament, everything devoted to the Lord, including the tithes, belongs to Levites for their full-time ministry in the sanctuary services. Numbers chapter 18. In the Old Testament again, a tithe was given in support of the king as a royal tax. When you read 1 Samuel chapter 8 verses 15 to 17, you appreciate that the political head of Israel was financed by a tenth of the individual stated goods and property. And so one can see that as a nation, recognized nation, independent nation, Israel managed its political institution and a religious institution with tithing. Let's be more specific here. We are aware that Abraham returned a tithe to Melchizedek. Let's read Genesis chapter 14 verses 18 to 20, NIV. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High, and he blessed Abram, saying, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and praise be to God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand. Then Abraham gave him a tenth of everything. So you appreciate this one. Before even God instructed Israel to tithe their produce, Abraham tithed his produce. And listen to what Melchizedek said. Here, recognizing God as a creator of heaven and earth, and also delivering the enemies of Abraham into Abraham's hand. This is important. And based on these statements, Abraham gave him a tenth of everything, recognizing Melchizedek as the religious head to whom a tithe had to be given for God. And so that is a picture we find it. So we see that Abraham was operating within the cultural understanding in which he was brought up. We are also aware that Jacob promised to return a tithe to God. And this is what we read from Genesis chapter 28, verses 22 NIV. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, "If God will be with me and will watch over me on this journey I am taking, and will give me food to eat and clothes to wear, so that I return safely to my father's household, then the Lord will be my God." This is the first promise. "And this stone that I have set up as a pillar will be God's house." The third promise. "And of all that you give me, I will give you a tenth." All that you give me, I'll give you a tenth. So Jacob understood tithing as a response to what God has given him. So he sees God as the giver of all that he will have in the future. God will be responsible for giving him, and therefore, in appreciation, in recognition of God as the creator, as the giver, as a sustainer, he was going to give a tenth. And so that's what tithing meant to Jacob and Abraham in their religious worldview. Now, the Lord God underlines Abraham and Jacob's understanding of tithing this way. When you read Malachi chapter 3, verses 9 to 12, usually we read only verse 10, but read verses 9 to 12. NIV, "You are under a curse, your whole nation, because you are robbing me. Bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house. Test me in this, says the Lord Almighty, and see if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that there will not be room enough to store it. I will prevent pests from devouring your crops, and the vines in your fields will not drop their fruit before it is ripe, says the Lord Almighty. Then all the nations will call you blessed, for yours will be a delightful land, says the Lord Almighty." So we see here God is saying that I will protect you. I'll make sure that you are fruitful in everything that you do. I'll protect you from your enemies. Anything that will destroy your produce, I will make sure that you are protected. And so God is presenting himself here as a protector, as the one who gives the food. Everything that we toil for, he is a giver. And that without him, we cannot gain anything. So that is the picture of tithing. And so when you give a tithe, it signifies that you recognize him as a giver, as a protector, as the creator. Now, the following are noteworthy of the understanding of tithing in the Old Testament. Tithing existed in the religio-political setting prior to the founding of the nation Israel, and it served an institutional purpose, and that a tithing is only established when there is an institution, political and religious, and we have made it clear. Tithing is a recognition of God as the creator, provider, and sustainer, and that human beings owe their existence and well-being to him. Genesis chapter 14, verse 22, and this is what we see from the text. That is the understanding, and that God claims to be the owner of the tithe. It is important to also understand this. Now, before the institution of mandatory tithing for the Israelites and other offerings, God requested free offerings from the people of Israel to build him a sanctuary. So before the temple was built, before the priests were appointed to serve continually in the sanctuary, God only requested free offerings, voluntary offerings from the people. He did not mandate them to give anything. And so the point we are making here is that it was after the designation of Levites as the full-time ministers of God in the sanctuary services that the tithing system was instituted. following the ancient Near Eastern cultural practice. So it is very clear that tithing was not instituted in Egypt when the Israelites were slaves. Was not instituted when they were delivered immediately after their deliverance. No, it was not instituted whilst they were walking and experiencing many things and enjoying the food from the heaven, manna, and those things. No, it was instituted after there was a recognized and established religious and political institutions. These were the responsibilities of the priesthood. The priest officiated many offerings in the instituted temple services. The priest taught the people the statutes of God. So we are looking at the responsibilities of the priests that made them qualify to be remunerated for the rest of their lives. The priest determined whether a person was sick or healthy. So we look at the responsibilities of priests. Basically was to officiate the offerings and also teach the people and determine whether a person was sick or healthy. These are the three basic responsibilities of priests in the Old Testament. Therefore, the institution of tithing system had the sole purpose of ensuring devoted ministry of the priestly order. Basically that. So that's the religious aspect of tithing. We have looked at 1 Samuel chapter 8 that tithing was to also be given for the regulation and the maintenance of the political institution. We now come to the New Testament. We want to understand how full ministry was supported in the New Testament. The fact that Judas kept the money bag suggests that Jesus and his disciples were supported financially by other people. John chapter 13 verse 29. Now Jesus and disciples relied on the financial contributions of people because they were not doing any other work. They left their work to be in full-time ministry, and they could not go and collect tithe from people because their ministry was not all that recognized by the nation. It was not institutionalized, it was not recognized, and therefore they had to rely on the benevolence of people. So when we read Luke chapter 8 verse 1 to 3, we see some women who were attracted to the gospel giving help to Jesus and his disciples. Jesus expected his disciples to be taken care of by wealthy families as they preach the gospel. Matthew chapter 10 verses 9 to 15. Jesus says that as you go, don't bring anything with you. You just go and knock at any door and make sure that you are taken care of by wealthy people. And once they accept you, bless them. If they don't accept you, just leave and move on to another place. And so there was no established way of remunerating or taking care of their personal needs. And that was the only way that they could be taken care of. Jesus and disciples were invited to several homes to share meals as itinerant ministers because they were moving around from one city to another. They had to accept invitations to other people's homes to share the meals to maintain their physical health. Jesus taught the disciples to return tithe and practice justice. Jesus never discouraged tithing. He said you must return your tithe and be faithful, at the same time be fair in your dealings with other human beings. The early congregation after Jesus' ascension shared their belongings. Paul tried to single out those who are preaching the gospel as people who deserve to be remunerated. And that when you read 1 Corinthians chapter 9 verse 13, he intimates that based on the conditions of services at the temple, in the same way, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should receive their living from the gospel. Verse 14 of 1 Corinthians chapter 9. And so, looking at the temple, how were those who serve in the temple remunerated? Basically from offerings and tithe. That is what Paul is saying. But the early congregation or the early church in the New Testament could not tithe people because it had not become an institution as the Jewish religion hard. But the whole point here is that those who preach the gospel have to be remunerated. That is what Paul is saying. Now, Paul received financial support from the church in Philippi while in Corinth preaching, and also in Roman prison. It is very important that we appreciate this one, that the church took care of them, even though the Gentile believers and all the other churches recognized that their headquarters was in Jerusalem, but they didn't have any financial structure, anything to really regulate the remuneration of the preachers of the gospel. And so they had to rely on individual churches, individual members to support them. So, for example, Paul expected the church in Corinth to give financial support for Timothy's transportation. 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 11. And also, John expected Gaius to give financial support for the ministry of some itinerant ministers who were moving from one place to another, that they had to be supported financially, because there were no financial regulation institution to support these people, even though Paul had made clear that in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 13 and 14, that preachers of the gospel had to be remunerated, but there was no financial institution because Christianity was not a legal religion in the first century and did not have the structures to manage the financial remuneration of these people who were preaching the gospel. Another Gaius in Corinth took care of Paul's needs while in Corinth during his 3-month winter stay. When Paul was writing the book of Romans, he mentioned in Romans chapter 16, verse 23, that I'm so appreciative of Gaius, of his benevolence and how he's taking care of me, my needs, and also the church. So Gaius was a wealthy person. So you can appreciate that what Jesus said, that as you go to preach the gospel, find people who are well-to-do and they will take care of you and you preach the gospel, because they didn't have any structures, they didn't have any financial structures to really regulate the financial remuneration of the people. Paul basically followed the principle that Jesus taught, that as you move with the gospel, as you preach the gospel, find someone who is well-to-do and is able to take care of you. And as long as you live in that place, make sure that person takes care of you. And as you leave the place, bless that individual. And so when Paul was writing to the church in Rome, he said that I appreciate what Gaius is doing and I bless him because he has taken care of me and the entire church. And I appreciate that. So Paul was essentially following what Jesus instructed. And that was how they were to be taken care of as itinerant ministers, as people who were moving from one city to another. The itinerant ministry of the apostles could not be managed by regulated remuneration with consistent contributions from church members. The beginnings of the New Testament church was a movement. Even though the churches across the then world recognized Jerusalem as the headquarters of the church, when you read Acts chapter 15 in particular. However, the church saw itself as a global church, saw itself as a movement, and that did not have any structures to regulate the financial remuneration of the preachers of the gospel. And therefore, they all followed what Jesus taught, that find people who will be willing to open their homes for you and let them take care of you, and as you leave, bless them. So they relied on this itinerant strategy of financial management. They were basically preachers. They were basically the guardians of the movement of the gospel. The pre-institutional establishment of the NT churches required voluntary contribution from individuals, following the practice of the pre-institutional establishment of the temple services and priesthood in the Old Testament. As we read from Exodus chapter 25, verses 1 to 8, God requested voluntary offerings to help build the sanctuary. He did not ask them to pay tithe because the religious institution had not been established. The same thing is found in Acts chapter 6. Because they had not established the churches, and they were moving and sharing the gospel on voluntary contribution from individuals. You see the same pattern, that before there's an institution, there is voluntary contributions, and when there's an institution, then we have regulated contributions from church members or the citizens of a state. Let's understand this before we conclude. The established churches in the New Testament period began experimenting with church organization with appointment of leaders, but with no formalized regulations. When you look at Acts chapter 20, verses 17 and 34, Philippians chapter 1, verse 1, 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 1 to 3, Titus chapter 1, verses 6 to 9, we understand that the churches in the New Testament started appointing leaders to manage the churches, especially when the apostles had established the church and had left the place. They had to appoint people to manage those churches. And these management were temporal, were not full-time management. They were only to guard them until the apostles return. So in the ministry of Paul, anytime Paul established a church, he would return to check on the church regularly. And as he returned, he talked to the elders and found out how the church was doing. And so when you read Acts 20 in particular, he tells them that as I leave the church in your care. Make sure that you manage. Make sure that you manage. Here, he did never ask the church to pay them, because they saw themselves as apostles, as those who were responsible ultimately for the church. And their remuneration was based on the principle that Jesus taught. They did not expect the elders to be paid, because they were not fully in charge of the churches. They were as apostles. In Ephesians chapter 4, verse 11, Paul writes that a pastor teacher is a gift from the Holy Spirit, and that a pastor teacher is identified as an office that shepherds the church of God. Being a church elder, a church leader, is a gift from God, and that is an office, and it means manager, and that's what Paul sees and identifies this gift in particular. Like the priestly order, the pastor teacher guides the flock through teaching and management, as we saw in the Old Testament, and that one of the responsibilities of the priest was to teach the people the statutes of God. In the New Testament, the pastor teacher, the elder who shepherds the church of God, has to teach the church and manage the church. Romans chapter 12, verse 8, and 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 4. I need you to appreciate this, that the New Testament church was a composite of house churches. When we say New Testament church, we are referring to different churches that were found in different houses. They didn't have structures as we have here. And so they had just a leader, and that leader was to manage the church. Because of persecution and because Christianity was not a legal religion, their meetings were not regular as we have today. And so the house churches were not having the institutional recognition as the Jewish religion had, with the temple services and with the priesthood establishment. And so there are two different things that we must appreciate. We are talking about house churches, not temple services. And therefore, the leaders of these house churches were not in full-time management or administration of these churches, because they were not meeting regularly, and they relied on apostles a lot for teaching and for guidance a lot. And that is why we need to appreciate the difference as we talk about remuneration of church leaders in the first century. With the threat of false teaching looming, when you read 1 Timothy in particular, Paul saw the growth of false teaching in the Asia Minor. It was necessary to establish remuneration for church leaders or elders who were stationed in each city, and also managing house churches, because the apostles could not be everywhere anytime. Because the apostles were moving, they could not manage all the teachings and force and respond to all the false teachings, and therefore they needed to have permanent people to manage the churches in their absence. And so we see that remunerating elders devoted to preaching and teaching became necessary, looking at the situation, the threat of false teaching. Paul counseled Timothy to ensure the remuneration of leaders of the church in Ephesus who were devoted to preaching and teaching the word and doctrine. 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 17. So we have to appreciate this whole thing. When the apostles were moving around managing the churches, they did not require the elders to be remunerated, because they could easily go around and return, check on the church, the health of the church. But when they saw that they could not manage everything themselves, they now had to recognize people who were ready to be devoted to preaching and teaching and protecting the church from false teaching. Paul urged the church to care for the poor and needy among them. According to Paul, God will supply the church's needs for their benevolence. The anti-direct that taxes be paid to the state is just the same principle we found in the Old Testament. That fine, we are Christians, we don't have a nation like Israel, yet we need to follow the same principle that we have inherited from the Asian Near Eastern cultures, that we must support the political institution, and that means pay a tenth, pay a tithe. The same way we must also take care of the preachers of the gospel. So the principle is the same. They never deviated from the principle of maintaining financially political and religious institutions. Note that the institution of tithes and offerings was intended to keep the consciousness of permanent recognition of God as the sustainer and provider of their needs in the Old Testament, as we have seen. Any regularized institution requires recognized leadership and a workforce to maintain the operations of the institution. Any form of monetary collection from the church member is hinged on the giving principles of the Old Testament outlined above to keep the church's operation. Whether voluntary offering or tithing, we are talking about a principle that is from the Old Testament. And so if one says that, well, tithing is an Old Testament principle, then voluntary offering is an Old Testament principle. And here we are looking at before an establishment of political and religious institution. Then you have voluntary offering. But the moment you have a political and religious institutions established, then there must be a regulated collection of offerings. And here we're talking about tithing is something that you can rely on regularly to maintain the establishment of political and religious institutions. Just like tax, any recognized state will need regularized tithing, or a tenth paid of stated goods and property to the state, so the state can run its affairs. Any institution requires that regulation of taxing. These principles point the giver to God as the sustainer and giver of life, hence worship through giving. Tithing is a form of giving. Tithing is a form of worship, recognition that God is a creator, provider, and sustainer. This is what God has claimed in the Old Testament, and Jesus also says that it should be continued in the Gospels. Now, let's conclude. Tithing was an established practice among the cultures of the Asian Near East to support national and religious management. The Old Testament essentially followed the practice of tithing in the ancient Near East. The patriarchs, Abraham and Jacob, returned tithe to God in recognizing him as the creator, provider, and sustainer. That's the understanding of tithing. Before the temple and the priestly order were institutionalized, voluntary offerings were encouraged by God to build his sanctuary. With the institutionalization of the temple worship and priestly order, tithing was mandated, with voluntary offering continuing as before. So, when the temple services, when the priestly order were establish. There was a need for tithing to be practiced with the voluntary offering to regulate and maintain these institutions. That is the point we are making here. Now, God claims the ownership of tithe, of stated goods and property. God is saying, I am the giver of whatever you plan to have in the future. I'll protect, I'll make sure that you get whatever you to have in abundance. So that protection, that strength giving you, sustaining you to be able to have what you plan to have, that requires us to tithe our produce in recognition of God as the giver, as the protector, as a sustainer of me to have what I plan to have. The New Testament church operated more like a movement with little institutional coherency, following the pre-institutional established voluntary contributions from the generous heart and the well-to-do believers. And this is a principle we find in the Old Testament before the establishment of the temple and the priestly order. And the same thing we find in the New Testament, because the New Testament believers saw themselves as people who are moving with the gospel. The New Testament affirms the need to remunerate the full-time minister of the gospel using the conditions of services in the temple as a case in point. Paul makes clear in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 13 to 14, that just as the priest who works in the temple is served or is remunerated from his services in the temple, so also the one who preaches the gospel has to be remunerated from the same service, meaning that those that he's ministering to have to remunerate, have to honor him. And that honor, how do you go about that? If Paul is using the temple as a case in point, then it means that the principle that was used to maintain the services and the life of the priest who served in the temple. When the church becomes an institution like the temple, then one can use the principles or the financial management principles of the temple service for the financial management of the church service today. That is, when the church becomes an institution, it's important to know this. In summary, because the New Testament churches operated as a growing movement, not an established and recognized institution in the first century, the remuneration of church leaders in the New Testament was based on voluntary offerings made by individuals as directed by Jesus. And so if you have to go strictly by what the New Testament is saying and what Jesus taught, Jesus was talking about evangelism, that as you move, you have to be taking care of those that you minister to and make sure that there are people who are doing very well. So you don't tax the poor people. Look for people who are able to welcome you to their homes, to their houses. And so that's what Jesus taught, and that's what the apostles followed. So they did not tax people, they did not ask people to give them money. Rather, they found places where people could take care of them, and they also blessed them as Jesus directed, because they were moving with the gospel. The New Testament period is a period of movement of the gospel. In the later part of the church, when the church was becoming a bit more organized, faced with false teaching and other external problems, the church had to formalize the remuneration of church leaders. And here again, they have to rely on individual contributions, because the church had not become an established institution recognized as the Jewish religion was. And therefore, it is important to understand that they have to rely on individual help. They have to rely on individual help, which was a reflection of the pre-institutional establishment of the temple services and the priestly order in the Old Testament. When Israel did not have a political institution having a king ruling over them, there was no need for them to pay royal tax as their neighbors were doing. When Israel didn't have a temple services, there was no need for them to pay tithe because they didn't have that. So there was no institution. So there was no need for a tithe. A tithe becomes necessary when you have a recognized institution, a recognized religious institution in a community. In the first century, Christianity was not considered a legal religion. In fact, tithing was practiced in the 4th century when Christianity became a legal religion. Before that, all the leaders were doing their own work. They never asked money from anyone. They were all taking care of themselves. As the apostles, they saw themselves as a movement. Christianity was a movement in the 1st century. Just like before the temple and the priestly institutions were established. And therefore, the leaders relied on the benevolence of rich people and individual contributions. And that's how they managed the churches, the then worlds. And they were meeting in houses, worshiping together, praying, singing. And so the leadership was not all that formalized and instituted as we see in the priestly order in the Old Testament and even the New Testament. And so that is why the New Testament believers did not return tithe, because tithing is connected to an establishment of an institution, a political or religious institution. And Christianity was not an institution in the 1st century, rather a movement. I hope we have understood our presentation today and that will be a blessing as we share with the world. See you again as we come your way with another exciting episode of Bible Talk Class. Thank you and have a wonderful day. Bye.
Sleep not as do